Moving into a new apartment should have been an exciting fresh start, but for me, it was more of a logistical nightmare. Between the strain on my meager savings and the overwhelming emptiness of my new space, I found myself scouring Craigslist at midnight, searching for cheap secondhand furniture to fill the void. That's when I stumbled upon the ad. Antique mirror for sale, unique piece. Make me an offer, it read. The attached photo was grainy, but even through the poor resolution I could tell there was something arresting about it. The mirror was massive, easily 5 feet tall, with a thick black wooden frame carved with intricate patterns. The designs were hard to make out, but they seemed to twist and writhe, almost organic in their flow. My gut churned as I stared at it for a moment too long, but I shrugged it off as hunger and sent the seller a message. The reply came within minutes, almost as if they'd been waiting. Take it off my hands. Free if you pick it up tonight, they wrote. Free? That should have been a red flag. Instead, I only saw an opportunity. I borrowed my friend Caleb's truck and drove out to a dilapidated house on the edge of town. The neighborhood was one of those places where streetlights flickered more than they illuminated, casting jittery shadows that made the already worn-out houses look like they were crumbling in real time. The seller, a wiry man in his 40s with sunken cheeks and darting eyes, met me on the porch. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone, or something, to follow him. He barely spoke, waving me toward the mirror, which was propped against the peeling siding of the house. It's unique, he said, his voice tight and flat. He wasn't wrong. Up close, the carvings on the frame were even more mesmerizing, but not in a pleasant way. They seemed alive, almost shifting when the light caught them just right. I thought I saw faces in the wood, warped and grotesque, but I blinked, and the shapes became abstract again. Are these symbols? I asked, running my hand over the grooves. Just take it, he cut me off, his voice rising with urgency. Please. I hesitated, the hairs on the back of my neck bristling. Why are you giving it away? It doesn't fit my style anymore, he said unconvincingly, his gaze darting to the street. Normally I'd have walked away from such a weird exchange, but something about the mirror drew me in. I felt a strange compulsion, as though it wanted me to take it. The eerie beauty of the frame was magnetic, and I liked the vibe. It had a gothic, almost haunted charm that suited my eclectic taste. So I shrugged off the seller's odd behavior, handed over a polite thanks, and loaded it into the truck. Driving back, I couldn't shake the image of his face, the way his eyes had widened when I lifted the mirror, the relief, bordering on desperation, that washed over him as I drove away. But I chalked it up to the strangeness of strangers. People on Craigslist were always a little off, right? Back at the apartment, I hauled the mirror up 3 flights of stairs, nearly breaking my back in the process. It was absurdly heavy, as though the wood was denser than it had any right to be. I leaned it against the wall in the corner of my living room, wiped the sweat from my brow, and stepped back to admire it. It really was stunning. The carvings were more intricate than I'd realized, almost hypnotic. I tilted my head, trying to decipher the patterns. Were they plants, animals, faces again? It felt like they were just beyond the edge of comprehension, teasing me with their elusive meaning. I told myself I'd figure it out later. for now I was exhausted and starving. As I turned to leave the room, I thought I saw something flicker in the mirror's reflection. Just a shadow, maybe, or a trick of the dim light. I paused, heart skipping a beat. But when I turned back, the reflection was perfectly still. Just my apartment, empty and quiet. Shaking my head, I laughed nervously and muttered, "Get a grip." I didn't know it then, but that mirror would be the start of something far darker than I could ever have imagined. Something that would make me wish I'd left it right where I found it. The mirror transformed my living room. With its massive size and ornate frame, it drew the eye immediately, making my otherwise plain apartment feel like it had a touch of Gothic elegance. I placed it carefully, leaning it against the far wall so it reflected the entire room. During the day, it captured the golden light streaming through the windows, softening the edges of my sparse furniture and giving the illusion of a larger, more inviting space. At first, I was proud of the find. I'd paid nothing for a piece that looked like it belonged in a museum. Friends who visited, even Caleb, who was usually indifferent to home decor, commented on its striking beauty. "You sure you didn't swipe this from some haunted house?" Caleb joked during one visit, tapping the frame with his knuckle. I laughed it off at the time, but now I wonder if his offhand remark was more accurate than either of us realized. It didn't take long for things to feel off. The first incident was subtle, so much so that I nearly convinced myself it didn't happen. It was late afternoon, and the setting sun threw long, slanted beams of light into the room. I'd been unpacking a box of books, trying to make the apartment feel less sterile. The mirror stood in my peripheral vision as I worked, and out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something move. It was faint, just a flicker, like a shadow passing through the reflection. My breath hitched, and I turned sharply to look behind me, expecting to see, what? An intruder? A trick of the light? But there was nothing there. The room was still, bathed in the warm glow of sunset. I let out a nervous laugh, shaking my head. "You're just tired," I muttered to myself. The move, the long nights, the stress. It was all catching up to me. Still, my hands trembled slightly as I went back to arranging books on the shelf, glancing over my shoulder at the mirror more often than I cared to admit. The second time wasn't so easy to dismiss. It was late at night, a few days later, the kind of night where the world feels especially quiet, like it's holding its breath. I had the lights off, the only illumination coming from the TV as I binged my way through a mindless series. The mirror, angled just right, reflected the flickering glow of the screen. I remember staring at the reflection, noticing how distorted the images looked in the old glass, like the mirror wasn't just showing the room, but adding its own interpretation. It gave me an odd, queasy feeling, but I told myself it was the warping of the glass, nothing more. Then it happened. At first I thought it was part of the show, a quick movement in the corner of the screen. I glanced down at the TV, but the characters were sitting around a table, talking. No movement, no sudden action. My eyes darted back to the mirror, and my stomach dropped. Something, or someone, had moved in the reflection. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The movement had been subtle, a blur in the corner of the mirror, but this time, I was certain I hadn't imagined it. My gaze locked onto the glass, scanning every inch of the reflection for signs of life. And then I saw it. A hand. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like it was just beneath the surface of the mirror. But as I stared, it became clearer, pressing against the inside of the glass. Pale and sickly, with unnaturally long fingers that ended in cracked, jagged nails, it moved slowly, deliberately. The hand traced along the frame, almost caressing the carvings as it moved. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on me like a physical weight. My chest tightened, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. The hand continued to move, its fingers lingering over the intricate designs carved into the frame. The wood seemed to react to the touch, the patterns shifting and twisting under the hand's influence. It wasn't possible, but I saw it. The carvings writhed, as though alive, as though welcoming the touch. I stumbled back, knocking over a can of soda that had been sitting on the coffee table. The fizzy liquid spilled across the floor, soaking into the worn carpet, but I barely registered it. My eyes remained fixed on the mirror. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The hand paused, as if it had heard me. For a brief, horrifying moment, it seemed to press harder against the glass, the fingers splaying out like a spider ready to pounce. I could see the faint outlines of veins beneath the translucent skin, and my stomach churned with a mix of fear and revulsion. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the hand withdrew. It didn't pull back naturally. It seemed to dissolve, fading into the depths of the mirror. The surface shimmered faintly, like water disturbed by a breeze, before returning to its usual placid state. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation. Maybe I'd fallen asleep and imagined it. Maybe it was some strange play of light on the old glass. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't forget the feeling. The overwhelming sense that something was in that mirror, watching, waiting. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the room, as far from the mirror as I could get, my back against the wall, and my eyes darting toward the glass with every flicker of light. The TV played on, but I didn't hear a word of it. My mind was too loud, filled with questions I didn't want answered. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept into the room, I was a wreck. Exhausted but too scared to sleep, I stared at the mirror, half expecting the hand to return. But the glass remained still, reflecting the now faded light of the TV and the chaos of my overturned soda can. For a moment I considered covering it up, throwing a sheet over it and pretending it wasn't there. But some part of me, whether out of curiosity, defiance, or fear, stopped me. I couldn't turn away from it. I couldn't stop staring at the mirror. Every day it drew me in, commanding my attention like a magnet. The more I looked at it, the harder it became to convince myself that the strange things I'd seen were just tricks of the light or my overactive imagination. Something about that mirror didn't belong in this world. It wasn't just old or unique. It felt wrong, as if it had a presence, a personality, even an agenda. The carvings on the frame seemed different every time I looked at them. They weren't just intricate patterns. They were alive with purpose. Some days I swore I could make out faces twisted in silent screams. Other times the shapes seemed to depict coiling vines or slithering snakes. The designs were subtle, shifting only when you weren't looking directly at them. It was maddening but I couldn't stop trying to decipher them, like they held some key to understanding what was happening. Then came the night I saw the door. It had been a particularly restless evening. Sleep had been eluding me for weeks, and the dark circles under my eyes were growing darker by the day. I sat on the couch, staring at the mirror, hoping, praying for some kind of explanation. I told myself that if I could just sit there long enough, the truth would reveal itself. It was absurd, but so was everything about the mirror. At first, it was the same as usual. My reflection stared back at me, tired and hollow-eyed, with the dim glow of the lamp casting strange shadows across the room. But as I watched, something changed. At first it was subtle, a faint shimmer like heat waves rising off asphalt on a summer day. Then, the reflection began to ripple, as though the surface of the glass were made of water. And then I saw it. A door. It wasn't in my apartment, but it was there, unmistakably reflected in the mirror. It stood tall, made of aged, dark wood that looked like it belonged in an ancient castle or a medieval cathedral. The grain of the wood was uneven, knotted and scarred, as if it had withstood centuries of wear. A heavy iron handle jutted out from the side, blackened with age and shaped like a serpent coiled into a loop. The edges of the door were framed with faint carvings, not unlike those on the mirror, but more angular and pronounced. I blinked, convinced I was imagining things, but the door remained. My stomach turned cold as I leaned closer to the mirror, my breath fogging the glass. The door was perfectly centered in the reflection, where my living room wall should have been. I turned to look at the wall itself, half expecting to see it there, but the wall was blank, just chipped paint and a smattering of picture hooks left behind by the previous tenant. Yet in the mirror, the door stood solid and real. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I stepped closer to the mirror, my trembling fingers reaching out to touch the glass. The surface was cold, smooth, unyielding. The door didn't vanish or distort. It stayed exactly where it was, as though daring me to confront it. I crouched down to peer more closely at the reflection. The details became clearer the longer I looked. There were faint scratches around the iron handle, like claw marks, and the wood seemed to pulse faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if it were alive. A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled back, suddenly overwhelmed by the sense that I wasn't supposed to be seeing this. And then, something new happened. The door moved. It didn't swing open dramatically or creak on invisible hinges. It simply shifted, the faintest quiver, as though it were breathing. My reflection in the glass blurred slightly, distorted by the movement, and I took an instinctive step back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to look away, to run out of the apartment and never return, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the mirror. The door was hypnotic, and despite my fear, a strange curiosity began to take root. Where did it lead? What was on the other side? Was it the source of the hand I'd seen before? Before I could think better of it, I leaned in again, this time noticing something I'd missed earlier. There was light spilling from underneath the door. It wasn't normal light. It was dim and sickly, a pale greenish glow that seemed to pulse in time with the faint movements of the wood. The longer I stared at it, the more uneasy I felt, as if the light were trying to worm its way into my mind. I heard a noise then, faint but distinct, a soft scraping sound, like nails running down the other side of the door. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it sent a jolt of terror through me. My chest tightened and I struggled to breathe, my ears straining to pick up any other sounds. For a moment, everything was silent. Then came the knock. 3 sharp, deliberate raps, not loud, but forceful enough to send a tremor through the glass. My entire body froze, paralyzed by a wave of primal fear. Someone or something was on the other side of that door, and it wanted me to know it was there. The knocks echoed in my ears long after they stopped. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was the door some kind of gateway? Was it trying to draw me in? And, most terrifying of all, what would happen if I opened it? I backed away from the mirror, my hands shaking so violently that I had to press them against my sides to steady myself. My breath came in shallow gasps as I grabbed the nearest blanket and threw it over the mirror, covering it completely. The knocking didn't come again, but the oppressive sense of being watched lingered, pressing down on me like a physical weight. For the first time since bringing the mirror into my apartment, I considered getting rid of it. But even as I thought it, a darker part of me whispered that it wouldn't matter. The door was there now, and something behind it knew I had seen it. The nights in my apartment grew longer, darker, and heavier. The mirror had become an unwelcome centerpiece in my life. Even with the blanket draped over it, its presence was inescapable, like a pair of eyes constantly watching. My dreams, when I managed to sleep at all, were haunted by images of the door, its knotted wood, the serpent-shaped handle, and that sickly, pulsing green light. But worse than the dreams were the sounds. The first time I heard it, I was half asleep, caught in that disorienting liminal space between waking and dreaming. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a soft scratching, like nails raking gently against wood. My eyes snapped open, my body tensing as I strained to pinpoint the source. It was coming from the direction of the mirror. I lay in bed, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, or perhaps the building settling. It wasn't uncommon to hear creaks and groans in this old apartment. But deep down, I knew this was different. The sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like someone, or something, was tracing its fingers over the surface of the glass, testing it, searching for a way through. It stopped after a few minutes, leaving me in suffocating silence. But the damage was done. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was wide awake when it started. I'd been sitting on the couch, pretending to read, though my eyes barely skimmed the words on the page. My attention was fixed on the mirror, its covered form looming like a shadowy monolith in the corner of the room. The scratching began softly, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. It sent an icy prickle down my spine. I tried to ignore it, clutching my book tighter and forcing myself to read the same sentence over and over. But the noise grew louder, more insistent, like nails scraping against a coffin lid. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. I wanted to run, to leave the apartment and never come back, but my legs felt rooted to the floor, frozen by some invisible force. It was as if the mirror was daring me to come closer, taunting me with its sinister melody. For hours I sat there, waiting for the sounds to stop. They eventually did, But the silence that followed was almost worse. It felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. By the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. The scratching began just after midnight, as it always did. I was lying in bed, clutching the blankets to my chest, my eyes fixed on the doorway to the living room where the mirror lurked. My body trembled with fear, but a strange resolve crept over me, born out of exhaustion and frustration. I couldn't keep living like this, paralyzed, sleepless, and afraid. I needed answers. I got out of bed, every step toward the living room feeling like a march to my own execution. My hands were clammy, and my legs threatened to give out beneath me, but I forced myself to keep moving. The scratching grew louder as I approached, almost as if it sensed my presence and wanted to greet me. The blanket covering the mirror shifted slightly, as though stirred by an unseen breeze. I stopped in my tracks, my throat tightening. For a moment I considered turning back, but the scratching persisted, each stroke a challenge I couldn't ignore. With trembling hands, I reached out and pulled the blanket off. The mirror's surface was dark, reflecting nothing but the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. The carvings on the frame seemed more pronounced than ever, their twisting patterns almost writhing in the dim light. I stared at the glass, my heart hammering, waiting for something, anything, to happen. That's when I heard it. A knock. It was faint but deliberate. A soft rap, rap, rap that came from inside the mirror. My entire body went cold. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, muted and hollow, as though it had traveled a great distance to reach me. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the coffee table, my eyes wide with terror. But the knock came again, louder this time. The glass seemed to vibrate faintly with the impact, though the surface remained unbroken. My instinct screamed at me to run, but another part of me, some sick curiosity I couldn't control, urged me forward. I reached out with a trembling hand, my fingertips hovering just above the surface of the glass. It was as though an invisible force pulled me closer, compelling me to touch it. The room felt colder the nearer I got, the chill seeping into my bones. When my fingers finally brushed the glass, I gasped. It was freezing, colder than ice, colder than it had any right to be. The chill burned against my skin, and for a moment, I thought my hand would stick there, frozen in place. I yanked it back, cradling it against my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The knocking stopped. The mirror fell silent, its surface once again calm and unassuming. But I knew better. Whatever was inside, whatever was knocking, it wasn't gone. It was waiting. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the room, as far from the mirror as possible. My eyes never left it, watching for any sign of movement, any flicker or shimmer that would betray the thing lurking within. I didn't dare touch it again. Not after what I'd felt. Not after what it had felt like it wanted. By dawn, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed to the point of breaking. I wanted to get rid of the mirror, to take it far away and leave it for someone else to deal with. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. This wasn't just about the mirror anymore. It had wormed its way into my life, into my very mind. It wouldn't let go. I'd always prided myself on being a creature of routine. Even with the strangeness surrounding the mirror, I clung to the structure of my days like a lifeline. Wake up, make coffee, go to work, come home, watch TV. sleep. But the mirror began to unravel that carefully constructed normalcy, twisting my days into a chaotic blur. It started subtly. A misplaced object here, a forgotten moment there. I'd find my phone in the kitchen when I was certain I'd left it in the living room. A book I'd been reading would be back on the shelf, marked at a page I hadn't reached yet. At first, I chalked it up to stress and lack of sleep. After all, I hadn't had a decent night's rest since the mirror entered my life. But then the gaps began to grow. One evening, I sat down on the couch to binge a show, intending to watch a single episode before bed. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my bed, the sunlight streaming through the blinds. My phone, which I always kept on the nightstand, was on the coffee table. The blanket I'd been using was crumpled in a corner of the room. I checked the time, my stomach lurching when I saw that it was already noon. Somehow I'd lost nearly 12 hours, with no memory of how I'd gotten from the couch to my bed, or what I'd done in between. At first I dismissed it as sleepwalking, something I'd never experienced before but knew could be triggered by stress or exhaustion. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. The next incident left no room for doubt. I woke up one morning to a sharp, stinging sensation in my arms. Groggy and disoriented, I threw back the covers and gasped. Angry red scratches crisscrossed my forearms, shallow but numerous, as though I'd clawed at myself in my sleep. My nails were caked with dirt, and the sheets were smudged with muddy streaks. The smell of damp earth lingered in the air. Panicked, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and froze. My shoes were at the foot of the bed, coated in dried mud. My heart raced as I stared at them, my mind struggling to piece together an explanation. I hadn't left the apartment the night before. I was certain of it. I hadn't gone anywhere. Had I? I stumbled to the bathroom, flipping on the light and splashing cold water on my face. When I looked up at the mirror above the sink, my stomach dropped. My reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong. My hair was matted, as though I'd been running through the woods, and my face was streaked with dirt. But the worst part was the expression. I wasn't smiling, but my reflection was. The grin stretched unnaturally wide, too wide, as though it didn't belong on my face. The lips curled upward, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. My reflection's eyes glinted with a malice that wasn't mine, a cruel amusement that turned my blood to ice. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the tiled floor. The grin vanished in an instant, my reflection once again mirroring my horrified expression. My chest heaved as I tried to steady my breathing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. A trick of the light, a hallucination, a lingering nightmare. It had to be one of those, didn't it? But the dirt under my nails, the scratches on my arms, and the mud on my shoes were all too real. I couldn't ignore them. For the rest of the day, I felt like I was moving through a fog. Time seemed elastic, stretching and contracting in ways that made no sense. Minutes passed like hours, and hours disappeared in the blink of an eye. I found myself checking the clock obsessively, desperate for some tether to reality. But even that offered no comfort. My memories of the day felt fragmented, as though pieces had been ripped away and replaced with static. That night, I avoided the mirror altogether. I draped it with the thickest blanket I could find, then pushed the couch in front of it for good measure. Even then, I couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the corner of the room, half expecting the mirror to reveal itself, the blanket sliding off as though by some unseen hand. I stayed awake as long as I could, sitting in the kitchen with every light in the apartment turned on. But eventually, exhaustion claimed me. I drifted off at the table, my head resting on my folded arms. When I woke, it was still dark, and the apartment was eerily silent. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and immediately felt a wave of dread. My arms were scratched again, fresh red lines overlapping the older ones. Dirt flecked the table where my hands had been resting. And when I turned toward the living room, my stomach twisted. The couch had been pushed aside. The blanket was gone. The mirror stood uncovered, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. My reflection stared back at me, and this time, I knew it wasn't me. The grin was back, wider than ever. The mirror had become unbearable. Its presence loomed over my every waking moment, a malignant force that tainted the air in my apartment. I couldn't take it anymore. The nights spent staring at the door in the glass, the oppressive sense of being watched, the maddening knowledge that whatever was on the other side wasn't bound by my understanding of reality. I needed someone to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. That's when I called Mia. Mia and I had been friends for years, and she was one of the few people I trusted with the truth. She was skeptical by nature, grounded in science and logic, and had a knack for dismantling my overactive imagination when it spiraled out of control. If anyone could offer a rational perspective, or at least believe me, it was her. When I told her about the mirror over the phone, her reaction was what I expected. Laughter. "You're telling me you're scared of an antique mirror?" she teased, her tone light and incredulous. "What's next? Haunted furniture?" "It's not just a mirror," I insisted. My voice cracked under the weight of my fear. "You need to see it for yourself. Please, Mia." The hesitation in her response was brief, but it told me she heard the desperation in my voice. "All right," she finally said. "I'll come over. But if this is some elaborate prank, I'm making you buy me dinner." When Mia arrived, she was her usual confident self, joking about ghost hunters and urban legends as she stepped into my apartment. But her laughter faltered the moment she entered the living room. The mirror seemed to draw her gaze immediately, silencing her mid-sentence. Her smile faded, replaced by an expression of uneasy curiosity. "Okay," she said slowly, stepping closer to the mirror. "That's definitely creepy. But it's still just a mirror, right?" "It's not just a mirror," I repeated, my voice trembling. "Look closer." Mia shot me a wary glance before leaning in, her eyes narrowing as she examined the glass. For a moment, her expression was unreadable. Then her face went pale. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, pointing at the faint outline of the door reflected in the glass. "You see it?" Relief and dread warred within me. "Yeah," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's a door." She stepped back, rubbing her arms as though trying to shake off an invisible chill. I could see the wheels turning in her head, her rational mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. "That's not normal," she said, her tone flat. "Why is there a door in the mirror?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's been there ever since I brought it home." Mia's brow furrowed as she peered at the door, her breath fogging the glass. Then her body stiffened. "Something moved," she said sharply, taking a step back. "What?" My heart raced. What did you see? I don't know. Her voice was tight, and her eyes darted nervously between the mirror and me. It was just a shadow, I think, but it moved behind the door. My stomach dropped. What kind of shadow? Did it look like a person? Mia didn't answer right away. She seemed to weigh her words carefully before finally shaking her head. I couldn't tell, she said, her voice strained. And I don't want to find out. Her reaction unsettled me more than anything I'd seen in the mirror. Mia was never one to scare easily, yet her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. Whatever she had seen, or thought she had seen, had shaken her to the core. We decided to cover the mirror, hoping to block whatever influence it had. Mia grabbed the thickest blanket she could find and helped me drape it over the glass. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small measure of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from the room. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to dissipate, replaced by a fragile sense of normalcy. There, Mia said, stepping back to survey our work. Out of sight, out of mind. But I noticed she avoided looking directly at the covered mirror, as if even its hidden form unnerved her. She stayed with me for a while, trying to distract me with light conversation, but it was clear her heart wasn't in it. Her eyes kept flicking toward the mirror, her shoulders tense. When she finally left, she hugged me tightly. Get rid of it, she said, her voice low and serious. I mean it. I nodded, though I wasn't sure how. The mirror felt impossible to remove, as though it had rooted itself into my apartment, into my life. That night, I tried to sleep, telling myself the blanket would hold. But around midnight, I woke to a sound that sent ice through my veins, the faint rustling of fabric. I sat up in bed, my breath caught in my throat. The sound came again, louder this time, like something was shifting and pulling at the blanket. I forced myself to move, my legs trembling as I crept toward the living room. The rustling stopped just as I reached the doorway. For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. Then I saw it. The blanket lay crumpled on the floor, as though it had been ripped away by unseen hands. The mirror stood exposed, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. The door in the glass was wide open, revealing a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow the faint reflections of the room. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The darkness behind the door felt alive, a void teeming with unseen things. My instincts screamed at me to run, to turn away, but my feet were rooted to the spot. A faint sound emerged from the mirror, a low, almost imperceptible whisper, like wind through a hollow tunnel. I strained to hear it, though every fiber of my being begged me not to. The whisper grew louder, forming words that sent a shiver through my soul. Come closer. The cold in my apartment had taken on a sinister life of its own. No matter how high I turned the thermostat or how many blankets I wrapped around myself, I couldn't escape the chill. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that made you feel small and exposed, no matter where you went. The mirror seemed to be the source, a black hole of icy dread in the corner of my living room. Then, one night, the temperature dropped even further, plunging the apartment into a still, oppressive cold, the kind that muffled sound and made the air feel heavy. That's when I saw him. I'd been trying to distract myself with a movie, something lighthearted to take my mind off the door and the mirror and the events of the past few weeks. The TV cast flickering light across the room, creating long shadows that danced along the walls. I sat curled up on the couch, gripping a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, too afraid to leave the living room for even a moment. The mirror was uncovered again. No matter how many times I draped a blanket over it, the covering always ended up on the floor by morning. I had given up trying, resigning myself to its uncovered presence like an unwelcome guest I couldn't evict. That's when the air shifted. It was subtle at first, like the feeling of being watched. My skin prickled and my breath hitched as the room grew eerily silent. Even the background hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade, leaving me in a vacuum of sound. I turned toward the mirror, and my heart nearly stopped. He was there. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The man stood just inside the door in the mirror, his figure stark against the darkness beyond the threshold. He was tall and thin, his silhouette sharp and angular, like a sketch brought to life. He wore a black suit, the fabric faded and frayed at the edges, as though it had been buried with him. The cut was old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in sepia-toned photographs from another century. But it was his face that sent a jolt of icy terror through me. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with a sickly sheen that reminded me of wax. His features were gaunt, his cheekbones jutting out sharply beneath hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the light. Those eyes, they were black and bottomless, twin voids that seemed to stretch into eternity. They locked onto mine, unblinking, and I felt my soul quiver under their weight. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply stared at me, his presence radiating a suffocating malice. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I turned sharply, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, my stomach dropped. The man was closer. He hadn't walked or shifted naturally. He was just there, a few feet closer than before. The movement, or lack thereof, was wrong, like a glitch in reality. His face was still expressionless, his black eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made my knees tremble. My reflection in the mirror was faint, overpowered by his figure, as though the glass had chosen him to be its primary occupant. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the coffee table, my mug of tea slipping from my grasp and shattering on the floor. The sound broke the oppressive silence, but the man didn't react. He just stood there, his pale face devoid of emotion. Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. He didn't respond, but his lips twitched, just slightly, as though he was on the verge of speaking, or smiling. The door behind him remained open, its darkness an infinite void. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement in the shadows beyond the door, a faint ripple of something shifting, alive and waiting. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. The man moved again. This time it was slow and deliberate. He took a single step closer, his body gliding forward without the natural sway of movement. It was unnatural, almost mechanical, and it made my stomach churn. His eyes never left mine, pinning me in place like a butterfly on a collector's board. I turned and bolted for my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it with shaking hands. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the door, as though the flimsy wood could protect me from whatever was in the mirror. My mind raced, cycling through every possible explanation, stress, exhaustion, hallucination, but none of them fit. I knew what I'd seen was real. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of the apartment sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I kept imagining him stepping out of the mirror, gliding silently into my apartment, those black eyes searching for me. When morning finally came, I ventured back into the living room, half expecting to find the man waiting for me. The mirror was empty. The door was closed. The reflection showed only my apartment, quiet and still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, just beyond the glass, watching, waiting. The call came in the dead of night, jarring me awake with its shrill insistence. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, my heart already racing. It was Mia. The screen glowed with her name, and for a moment, a small part of me felt relief at the thought of hearing a friendly voice. But when I answered, her panicked sobs erased any comfort. "Mia?" I said, sitting up in bed, clutching the phone tightly. "What's wrong? What happened?" "I saw him," she cried, her voice shaking. "He's here. He's in my apartment." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, suddenly wide awake. "What do you mean? Who's there?" "The man," she said, her voice cracking. "The man in the mirror. He's here." My breath caught. "Mia, listen to me. Tell me exactly what's going on." She took a shaky breath, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "I didn't tell you this before, but when I left your place last week, I took a picture of the mirror. I don't know why. I thought it was cool or something, and I wanted to show it to a friend." My stomach churned as I imagined Mia standing in front of the mirror, her phone aimed at its surface, oblivious to what she might be capturing. "Okay," I said cautiously. "And then what?" "I was looking at the photo tonight," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I noticed someone, standing behind me in the reflection. At first I thought it was a shadow or some trick of the light, but it's him. It's the man you told me about." My skin prickled with goosebumps. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she cried, the desperation in her voice unmistakable. "He's standing right behind me in the photo, clear as day. His face. It's so pale, and his eyes. Oh God, his eyes." Her voice broke, and she dissolved into sobs. I gripped the phone tighter, my own fear bubbling to the surface. "Mia, listen to me. You need to delete the photo, right now. Get rid of it." "I already did," she said through her tears. "I deleted it as soon as I saw him. But it's too late. I think he's here now." "What do you mean?" My voice wavered. "You think he followed you?" "I don't know," she wailed. "But I've been seeing things all night. Shadows moving in the corners of my apartment. Reflections that don't match up. And just now, I saw him." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Where did you see him?" "In the hallway," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was walking to the kitchen and I caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye. He was just standing there, watching me." "Mia," I said firmly, trying to keep the rising panic out of my voice. "Get out of your apartment. Go to a friend's place, a hotel, anywhere but there." "I can't," she whispered. "What if he follows me? What if I make it worse?" Her words sent a chill down my spine. Was that possible? Could the man in the mirror attach himself to us, to our lives? I didn't have answers, only the suffocating weight of uncertainty. Mia, you need to stay somewhere safe, I urged. We'll figure this out, but you can't stay there. She hesitated, her breathing uneven. What about you? She asked suddenly. What if he's still with you too? What if the mirror is just the beginning? The question hung in the air, a cold, heavy truth I hadn't wanted to face. I looked toward the living room, where the mirror stood in its usual spot, uncovered despite my earlier efforts to hide it. The thought of the man watching me through the glass, waiting for his next move, sent a shiver through my body. I'll figure something out, I said, though the words felt hollow. Just promise me you'll get out of there tonight. Mia didn't respond right away, and for a moment I thought the call had dropped. Then, in a trembling voice, she said, You have to get rid of that mirror. It's not just watching you anymore. It's following us. It's spreading. Her warning lingered in my mind long after the call ended. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the phone in my hands, her words replaying over and over. The man wasn't confined to the mirror. He wasn't just a passive presence. He was active, deliberate, and worst of all, mobile. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the apartment, every flicker of shadow, felt like a prelude to something worse. I stayed awake until dawn, the light creeping through the blinds offering little comfort. The mirror stood in the corner of the living room, silent and unassuming. But I knew better now. Whatever was inside it wasn't just bound to the glass. It had found a way out, and I was powerless to stop it. Desperation consumed me. The events of the past weeks, the door, the man, Mia's warnings, had pushed me to the edge. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think beyond the oppressive weight of the mirror's presence. It dominated my life, a black hole of fear that had swallowed every shred of normalcy. I had to end it. I had to destroy the mirror. The decision didn't come lightly. Part of me feared what would happen if I tried. Would smashing it release whatever lurked inside? Would it lash out, angry at being denied its foothold in my world? I didn't know, but the alternative, living in constant terror, was unbearable. I waited until nightfall, though I wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the cover of darkness, or perhaps some part of me understood that whatever resided in the mirror thrived in the shadows. I needed to confront it when it was strongest, to prove to myself, if nothing else, that I wasn't afraid anymore. I retrieved a hammer from the kitchen drawer, my hands trembling as I wrapped my fingers around the cold metal. The weight of it felt comforting, solid, a tangible weapon against the intangible horrors that had invaded my life. I approached the mirror cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the apartment. The man was there. He stood just inside the door, his tall figure framed by the carvings on the mirror's frame. His black eyes locked onto mine, filled with a silent malice that sent a shiver down my spine. He didn't move, didn't react. As I raised the hammer, my chest heaving with a mix of fear and determination. "This ends now," I whispered, more to myself than to him. I swung the hammer with all my strength. The blow landed squarely on the glass with a deafening clang, but instead of shattering, the surface rippled, like a stone dropped into a pond. The sound reverberated through the room, unnatural and hollow, making my teeth ache. I stumbled back, staring in disbelief. The mirror was unscathed. The man moved then. It wasn't a step, not in the traditional sense. He seemed to glide forward, the space between us shrinking with an unnatural fluidity. His expression remained blank, but his black eyes gleamed with something that made my stomach churn. Amusement. He was toying with me. "Why won't you break?" I yelled, raising the hammer again. My voice cracked under the weight of my fear and frustration. I swung harder this time, putting all my weight behind the blow. The hammer struck the glass with another resounding clang, and again the surface rippled, but remained intact. The man's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. My blood ran cold as I realized he was enjoying this, feeding off my desperation. The door behind him creaked open wider, revealing a darkness so profound it seemed to devour the faint reflections of my living room. A rush of icy air swept through the room, carrying with it the faint stench of decay. It hit me like a physical force, making me stagger. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest tight with a mix of terror and defiance. "I'll keep trying," I said, though my voice wavered. "I'll smash you into pieces if I have to." The man tilted his head slightly, a gesture so subtle yet filled with mockery. And then he spoke. "Come inside," he said, his voice low and grating, like nails dragged across a chalkboard. The words weren't a suggestion. They were a command. My knees buckled, and I dropped the hammer, the clatter echoing in the oppressive silence. His voice reverberated in my mind, an invasive presence that felt like it was tearing me apart from the inside. I clutched my head, trying to block it out, but the words repeated over and over. "Come inside. Come inside. Come inside." The door in the mirror opened fully now, the darkness spilling out like a living thing. Shapes moved within it, vague, indistinct forms that writhed and twisted, their movements unnatural and grotesque. My vision blurred as the room seemed to tilt, the pull of the door's void overwhelming. "No," I whispered, forcing myself to crawl backward, away from the mirror. "I won't." But the pull grew stronger, an invisible force dragging me toward the glass. My body felt weightless, my limbs moving against my will. The man stepped aside, gesturing toward the door with a sweeping motion, as though inviting me into his world. I screamed, digging my nails into the floor in a futile attempt to anchor myself. My nails scraped against the wood, splintering painfully, but the pull didn't relent. My vision tunneled, the edges of the room fading into darkness as the void consumed everything. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the man's smile, wide, triumphant, and filled with a malice that would haunt me forever. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. The first thing I noticed was the light, or rather, the lack of it. The room I was in was dimly lit, the source of illumination unclear. It was a cold, pale light that cast no shadows, leaving everything bathed in a dull, lifeless glow. My head throbbed as I struggled to sit up, my hands brushing against smooth, cold surfaces. Mirrors. They were everywhere. Every wall was a mirror, their seamless surfaces reflecting each other in an endless loop. The effect was dizzying, a kaleidoscope of reflections that stretched into infinity. I stared at myself, or rather, at the countless versions of myself staring back. Each reflection was slightly off, their movements lagging a fraction of a second behind mine, as though they were hesitant to follow my lead. But not all of them moved at all. Some stood perfectly still, their faces frozen in expressions that weren't my own. One of them had a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, its teeth jagged and sharp. Another stared back at me with hollow eyes, black voids where there should have been irises. My stomach turned as I realized their features were wrong, twisted and distorted, as though someone had taken a human face and warped it like clay. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The mirrors showed me from every angle, leaving me no place to hide from the distorted versions of myself. I spun in a circle, searching for a door, a window, anything that would lead me out of this nightmare. But there was nothing, just mirrors, endless and suffocating. I pressed my hands against one of the mirrors, hoping to find some give, some hidden passage. The glass was cold and unyielding, but as I leaned closer, something shifted. My reflection moved, but not the way it should have. It tilted its head, its lips curling into a cruel smile that didn't belong to me. "Let me out," it whispered, its voice low and raspy. The words didn't come from the glass. They came from everywhere, echoing through the room like a sinister wind. I stumbled back, clutching my chest as my heart pounded against my ribs. I turned to another mirror, desperate for some semblance of normalcy, but the reflection there was worse. This one looked like me, but its face was cracked, as though the glass itself had split and taken my features with it. The cracks formed jagged lines that radiated outward, and dark liquid oozed from them, dripping down its face like black tears. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Let me go." But the reflections didn't respond, not with words at least. They moved closer, their faces pressing against the glass from the other side, their twisted mouths whispering things I couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping until they filled the room, drowning out my own thoughts. I fell to my knees, covering my ears in a futile attempt to block out the sound. But the voices weren't just external. They were inside me, worming their way into my mind, filling me with thoughts that weren't mine. Images flashed before my eyes, the man in the mirror, his black eyes burning with malice. The door, its darkness alive and writhing. The endless void that had swallowed me whole. Time lost all meaning. I didn't know how long I stayed there, trapped in the mirror room, surrounded by twisted versions of myself. Hours, days, weeks. The mirrors offered no clues. Their reflections were timeless, locked in their own malevolent reality. Then, one day, or perhaps it was night, I saw something different. Through one of the mirrors, I caught a glimpse of my apartment. It was faint, like looking through fogged glass, but it was unmistakably my living room. Relief surged through me and I rushed toward it, pressing my hands against the glass. "Help!" I shouted, pounding on the mirror. "I'm here! I'm still here!" The scene in the mirror shifted, revealing someone else, a stranger, standing in my living room. They were looking at the mirror, their head tilted in curiosity, much like I had done when I first brought it home. My screams grew louder, more frantic, but the stranger didn't react. They couldn't hear me. I banged on the glass until my hands were raw, my voice hoarse from screaming. But the stranger just stared at the mirror, oblivious to my presence. And then, slowly, their expression changed. Their brow furrowed, their eyes narrowing as though they sensed something wrong. They leaned closer, and for a fleeting moment, Our eyes met. "Don't!" I screamed, slamming my fists against the glass. "Don't look at it!" But it was too late. The man in the mirror appeared behind them, his pale face looming over their shoulder, his black eyes locking onto mine through the glass. His lips curled into a smile, triumphant, knowing. And then the reflection faded, leaving me alone once more. Now I wait. The mirror room has become my prison, my purgatory, and I don't know if I'll ever escape. The reflections still haunt me, their distorted faces mocking me from every angle. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the real world through the mirrors, other people who have brought the cursed glass into their homes, unaware of the darkness it holds. I try to warn them, but they never hear me. They never listen. And every time I see the man in the mirror, I know he's found his next victim.